So I want to start recording as well. And tonight, thank you for tuning in, everybody. This is Professor Michael Jahosky and Mythic Mission. I'm going to introduce my special guest here in a second. This is our second podcast / video for Mythic Mission. And I want to read just a little bit about our kind of mission statement, pun intended. Welcome to Mythic Mission with me, Professor Michael Jahosky. And tonight, my very special guest is my best friend and wife, Sarah, who is the creative genius behind the art of Mythic Mission and also the one who conspired with me to create this podcast. So on this podcast, I'm dedicated to bringing you a Christian apologetic that appeals to both the imagination and the intellect, especially the former. I will be focusing on the concept of mythos as it relates to Christian apologetics and Christian discipleship. Here on Mythic Mission, it is our goal to help you fill up the corners, a quaint Hobbit expression, of your heart and mind with theology, philosophy, and especially literature. So we are streaming live on Facebook tonight for family and friends in case they're tuning in. So you can say hi. I have to see if I can pull up. Yeah, I think I can see it streaming on Facebook. So I guess if somebody makes a comment or a joke, I can see it. So I have that there in case anybody, feel free to ask any questions tonight. Sarah has actually agreed to come on and ask me some questions about my book that, of course, she was so instrumental in helping get published. And so Sarah joins me tonight to talk a little bit about everything in my preface, really just kind of setting the stage for my book. And I'll let her take it away here in a second. She's got some questions that she came up with that also have to do with what we're trying to put out here on this podcast, which has to do with myth and the role that myth and imagination plays in being a Christian, and of course features in my book. So Sarah, thanks for coming on.
Oh, hello. Thank you for having me on. I've watched enough of your podcast now to know the first thing I should do is say thank you for having me on. I appreciate everyone listening. This is my first time doing a podcast, but I'm very excited.
Yeah, it's easy to do. You just be your lovely self. So we're really just kind of having a conversation. We don't want this to sound too formal. And Sarah and I wanted to do something personal that got a chance to feature us, but also that touches on the personal aspect of my book, which is the preface is usually the appropriate place in an academic book for that sort of thing. So I think that's what she's got, set up for us tonight. So
Yeah.
Sarah, do you feel like taking it away?
I wanted to say that I know in a lot of the podcasts that you've done already, you've talked about your book and the thesis of your book, and you've gone through some important points. I know with the Michael Heiser podcast, you went through each chapter, and I know we had talked about just focusing kind of on your preface, more of like your personal testimony, and kind of diving deep into the why behind why you did this, and just some key concepts you want to talk about. So I prepared some questions, some things that I already know, but other things that, I could always learn more about. But we want listeners to get to know you as the author a little bit better, and your personal journey, or as you call it in your preface, your road into Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question I have is about your encounter with Lord of the Rings. So your very first encounter, you talk about it in your preface when the Lord of the Rings comes into your life. Was it that you read the books first, or did you see the movies first? What kind of got you into Lord of the Rings?
Yeah. So Sarah, by the way, you've written some really fantastic questions. So for those of you that don't know, Sarah did a little stint in a semester with journalism at University of Florida. Was it a semester?
Like 2 years, actually.
Oh God. Okay. A little rusty on that. So that's what I said,
But
right?
I only spent one semester on reporting where I had to write questions. So technically only
Okay.
one
That's what
semester writing questions.
You saved me. Thank you. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. So aside from just being a bright and wise woman, she's a good framer of questions, which I always have a hard time doing when I'm building stuff for my class. So Sarah always helps build the syllabi and assignments for the classes. So this question obviously is probably closest to me, and we'll just start simply. So great question. I kind of discovered the books in the months before. I can't remember if it was the summer or the fall of 2001. The Fellowship of the Ring came out in December of 2001, I think it was. And oh my God, it's been 20 years, or will be. Soon. So Chris, my brother, and I, Chris, I think, um, got the Fellowship in paperback from Barnes and Noble, and we were living in Cocoa Beach. And I forget all the circumstances, but he came over one night and started reading. I had played like I think maybe it was a board game. Maybe I think Chris might have introduced. I remember because I can remember the closet I had in high school, and up there on the ledge, I think there was one of the first and earliest Lord of the Rings like card or board games, and I think he got me into that too. It's kind of coming back to me now. And whether that came first or the book came first, he read the book. We read through, I know, at least a couple of chapters. I remember not knowing what happened to Gandalf and annoying the shit out of him. Oop, pardon my language. With pestering him in the Two Towers. What would happen later? I think when we saw the second film together, it was like nonstop. I was questioning him. It probably something that he was used to for me doing when I was a kid. And he was like, just watch, you'll see what happens. So I know we hadn't finished the books by 2002. So we were reading through them. And I think by the third movie in 2003, I did have all the books read, but it took some time to complete them. And then I devoured The Hobbit and The Silmarillion in the years after that. So sorry about that non-academic slip there, but it happens, so that's okay. Sorry, listeners. So, but in truth, it was probably the wording he would have chosen at the time, because I really was pestering him about it. I was so excited. I wanted to find out what had happened to Gandalf. So that was kind of how I remember it.
So
And
it was
of
kind of
course,
a
yeah.
simultaneous, like a kind of a simultaneous, like kind of what happened with us with Harry Potter, would you
Yes,
say?
exactly. Yeah.
We
Mhm.
discovered the movies, but then the books kind of around the same time. And
And I think when we saw the Order of the Phoenix in which was book 5, right?
Mhm.
And movie 5, obviously, and then they did the 2 with the 7th book. But I think when we saw Order of the Phoenix, it was in Gainesville with Ashay, if you remember. So if she's out there listening, hi, Ashay. And we had ordered like I think, yeah, we were reading through the books and seeing the movies at the same time. So it was kind of like that. I can't remember with Harry Potter, but anyway, yes,
No,
that's
it was,
pretty.
you're right. I'm pretty sure Kelly was with us too.
Yeah, yeah, Kelly was with us. That's
Kelly
right.
had read the books and got us into it. It was like, you
Right.
have to read the books. It's so much better than the movie. So thank you,
Yeah.
Kelly.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelly. And I think Deathly Hollows had come out not, did that come out while the movies were? I can't remember. But anyway, yeah, it was similar to that, which is another series of books we'll be talking about on the podcast eventually. So that's something to look forward to.
So okay, so then kind of leading off of that question, with reading the books and the movies kind of simultaneously, when you think back to that time, what would you say really captivated you most about the story, or what was it that really got your attention about it? That just kind of was like, like I need to know more. I need to read. I need to watch the movie again, or what was the
Yeah.
most captivating thing about it?
I think so. I remember, and I don't know if it was it John Lee? I'm trying to remember the name of the artist. John Howe, I think, was one of the artists. I remember looking at the cover of the Fellowship of the Ring that Chris had, and it was one of the famous Tolkien artists. I think it might have been Howe, John Howe, I think his name is, and listening to it and just being transported and wanting to have real life kind of feel that urgent and that adventurous. And Tolkien really describes this really well. Just to kind of jump back to The Hobbit, which I read later, of course, but when Bilbo is listening to the dwarves sing, and Tolkien describes the world outside and the um, you know thoughts that Bilbo was having, and that's kind of how I felt when I first encountered it. It was a sense of realism and urgency, and I write about that throughout my book. And of course, at that time, I didn't make sense of how that could be possible, but I kind of just knew. And this is why I got into the video games and the board games and the card games, just because I wanted to immerse myself in as much Middle Earth as possible, because I felt that it was real and I felt that it was urgent, like life needed to feel this way.
Mhm.
And I remember years later, reading Peter Kreft's book, The Philosophy of Tolkien, the Christian worldview behind The Lord of the Rings, which is an excellent book. And I remember him saying something along these lines, and I quote him somewhere in the book that, there's a reason why we love Tolkien. And this is one of the things that I feel like he unpacked for me and that I built on in my book to try to explain why it feels real. It was almost like starting then, it was this quest that I had to explain to other people what the book was doing to me, so that other people who I know have had the same experience would now understand how it's affecting them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's like such a captivating story to begin with when you mentioned The Hobbit, just for everyone listening. So, Mike just started recently reading The Hobbit to both of our children who are almost 4 and almost 7. And I don't think I've ever seen them listen more intently to a story than they are with The Hobbit. So I just think it's you know interesting to see them kind of traversing this journey so early and finding such interest in it. I can't wait to see where that takes them
Oh
to.
yeah. Lucas tonight too was really on top of it, because we were out of the frying pan and into the fire. Chapter 6, I think it is, in The Hobbit. And there was a point where Tolkien says, and then the Hobbit heard voices. He was looking for the dwarves and Gandalf. He was wondering if he should go back into the goblin tunnels. And I go, Lucas, who are those voices that he thinks he hears? And he's like, it's Gandalf and the dwarves. I mean, he's totally into it.
Yeah, he
And
is.
he's not even 7. I mean, and it took me until I was almost, well, I guess I was 15, 16. Yeah. In the fall, winter 2001, when I discovered these books. So, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
I
Yeah.
think we're drawn as humans just to this sense of adventure. We're very much drawn to what The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is all about, which
Oh,
we can talk
yes.
about later.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but so in your preface, you talk about how, you had grown up a Catholic and then kind of strayed from Christianity, or a cradle Catholic, and then you returned to Christianity. So, what made you consider returning to Christianity? Was it the Lord of the Rings at the time, or is it something now you look back and think, what was kind of the path, your journey back to Christianity?
Yeah, my road into Jerusalem, which is C.S. Lewis has an essay called what was it? Christianity and Culture, and in one of the essay compendium books that you can get today on C.S. Lewis, and that was his phrase. Anyway, we'll get to that, but that's what that means. Your journey to Christ. That's what he meant by that. And in the essay, he's talking about how culture at large, things that are kind of not necessarily square inside the sacred tradition, can be somebody's road into Jerusalem, but it can also be like, oh man, I don't want anything to do with that. It can be our road out of Jerusalem as well. We can see things in culture that make us run from the church, and run towards it, and run towards Jesus, excuse me, more importantly. So a lot of things I write about in my book. So a couple of things happened. I'm sorry, I keep rubbing myself because I'm freezing up here. It got real cold all of a sudden. So if I seem like I'm trembling at some point, it's like, ooh, got so cold. A couple of things happened at this time. So I had just turned 16, right, 2001, and started reading the books. And I think just the year before that, and I might be getting the timeline overlapping, but 15, 16, my mom had become a Christian again, not too long before that, taking a renewed interest, and not in specific Catholicism. So really, Mom, you know this already, your zeal to understand the Bible and to apply it to your life. And I know we were both baby Christians again at that time, and weren't listening to the best preachers, as we would later find out. But we were trying, and we didn't really have any guides to really kind of point us on the way. So that was really kind of what did it for me. And I just remember kind of silently telling Jesus that I'm going to try to understand it better. But I did read the Bible. I was the prayer guy on the basketball team in high school, so I was studying. I was reading the Bible, but I didn't understand really what it was all about. I just thought, you read a verse and it's got power, and that was part of the spell we were under with Joyce Meyer and some of the other, for the little good I think that's there. That the rest of it is really quite negative, unfortunately, with the prosperity gospel. But I had a very almost superstitious view of it, and that for those of you that don't know, I'll share a personal note. Probably is a good place to also mention. I was kind of coming away from, and Mom will remember this. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it, but being addicted to online psychics at the time, and dabbling in things that just to try to understand things, to short circuit and go around God, and really was interested in the occult. But as a kid, I didn't know that. No excuse, but this was really quite powerful. But I think I brought some of that mentality with me, and I don't say this in the book for space purposes, but that was another detail. And I think that really kind of affected my mindset with reading the Bible and understanding it, Now, setting that aside, at the same time, as I already said, I discovered Lord of the Rings through Chris reading it to me, and then I, picked it up on my own. But I didn't see them as related. Okay, so it took until all the way until 2010 and 11 for me to start looking back on 2001, a decade, to start realizing what was going on with that connection. So I think it's just very providential that those two things happened. Obviously, I didn't plan it that way, but it's amazing that God kind of put those things in my life and then said, "Here, help me connect the dots together." And then 10 years later, we'll get into that later. But
Right. Well, it's funny that you mentioned, because you pretty much answered my next two questions. Because
oh,
I had asked, did you see a connection between Lord of the Rings and Christianity at first? Which you just said you didn't see the connection until years later. And also, I said, how long before you discovered the connection? And you just told us that about 5 or 6 years later, you
yeah.
discovered kind of the connection
Mhm.
between the two. But I want to talk still in the same realm of Lord of the Rings, but just the concept of myth. You talk a lot about what myth is. And I know that in last week's podcast with Dr. Marcos, you guys went into the concept of myth and how
Mhm.
it's been misunderstood over the years.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, I know if anyone hasn't listened to that podcast yet, you talk about how, we think in the modern sense of myth, we think something that's not true. So a lot of times you think Greek and Roman myths, well, they're not true. They're just hyperbolized, exaggerated stories of these gods and goddesses, and it was the way that ancient cultures tried to make sense of their world and how things happen and why things happen. And so when we say, oh, that's just a myth, we think that's not true. But you talk about in your book, and many scholars that you've researched and included their research as well, about that we actually have that meaning of myth is not correct. So can you first
Yeah.
briefly describe for us what the actual meaning of myth is? And then can you also talk about when you actually uncovered the true meaning?
Yeah. Great question. So let me tell you a story, and this will answer. In the starting in the 18th century, you have a lot of people in the philosophical world who are increasingly, in fact, really, there's not a perfect place to start the story, but maybe even back in the 16th century. And there are several nodes we could connect, but shortly after the Renaissance, and you have the emergence of this view that the mind is in possession of a rational faculty, the power of reason, and that our senses really could be very trustworthy and tell us all the data that we need to know about life, and that we need to filter that through the faculty of reason. And that between our senses and reason, John Locke especially was a huge proponent of this way of thinking. We can understand all of life's mysteries, and that we need to rely heavily on proven empirical methods of observation and data gathering, and this became one of the ways of doing science. And so this increasing reliance on the mind of reason, the faculty, the part of the mind that harnesses the power of reason, our senses. This is an ism known as empiricism. The reliance on reason alone is rationalism, and then finally, something that eventually emerged, this obsession with science being able to be the only arbiter of truth about the world we live in, is called scientism. And as this narrative built in Europe, especially with the French Revolution, and you have thinkers who were very disenchanted with religion, and you have that also in our American Revolution, among other historical and cultural moments I could point to, we started to rely on this understanding of truth, which is a statement about factuality, but truth is only knowable through those faculties of reason, the senses, and the sciences, and the scientific methods that help us arrive at that data. So truth is what we could prove that those ways, and that would mean, of course, that truth and factuality are in fact the same thing, that the world we live in is a scientific, sensual, and empirically observable world, and a rational world that can be understood through these avenues. And let me just stop right there. I didn't really tell this myth so eloquently. There's just so many things one would want to say, but the whole point is that I've just told you a story. And I could point to many other philosophers and different time periods. You can go back to ancient third century BC, and look at Epicurus and look at Zeno in the 4th century before him, and these Hellenistic philosophers, even thousands of years before the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. So see, I told you, you can go to different nodes here in history who were telling the same narrative. Epicurus's God was far away, uninterested in human affairs. And of course, that was brought on by his disenchantment with the Olympian gods. Now, I don't blame him. And I think his view was far better than the Olympian view. However, the one thing he lacked is that he lost his imagination. He lost the ability to think mythically. When we discarded the Olympian gods with all their capriciousness and cruelty, and you go to just a mind of pure reason and the senses and the budding sciences at the time, we're back in ancient Greece, remember, you lose so much. You atrophy the imagination, among other things. Okay, so these stories, whether we're talking about the ancient Greek version or the early modern story, that's just the thing. These are myths. So that leads us to our definition. Myth is story. Okay, mythos is a narrative about the way things are. Okay, and scholars like Alistair McGrath today are saying that mythos really was understood back in the time of Homer and Hesiod before it became changed by Plato and the Epicureans that I just mentioned. Was a narrated explanation about the way the world works, and that obviously contains a multitude of truths in it. But not all truth is literal or scientific or knowable through the senses. There's poetic truth and truth through metaphor and analogy and parable and so on and so forth. So myth is a storied explanation about the world. It is a story about reality. And when we understand that reality can be apprehended by the imagination as well as through the mind of reason, and that reason cannot do its thing without imagination, we realize that truth is also expanded, just as reality is expanded to be something that is not just literal, but there's such a thing as non-literal truth. So we're so accustomed to buying into the modern myth that we've forgotten the real meaning of myth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the simplest way I can put it.
And you talked with Dr. Marcos about the word mythology being
Mhm.
mythos and logos together. That
Yes, I can comment briefly. So mythos and logos originally meant something very similar. They're both accounts. It can just mean an account of something. Logos carries with it kind of a rational account, and mythos is kind of like an utterance, a dark saying, a proverb, a simile, an analogy, a parable, an allegory. Really, at the heart of this is a poetic utterance, and it is itself a poetic utterance about the way the world works, and generally, of course, it's a comment on the gods or the inner workings of man or woman, and of course those we usually resort to metaphor to really plumb those mysteries of being human. But the common denominator is that mythos and logos are both statements about fact, i.e. reality, and therefore they're both truth statements. They're just not true in the same way, but they are truth. And we've become so unaccustomed to thinking this way that we've invented a new myth, which is so ironic, as I'm hoping you're seeing, that eradicates the real myth. And so it's just hilarious how we've done this to ourselves. And this is something I'll comment on later, but Nietzsche saw this in the 19th century. And he was one of his greatest critiques, Friedrich Nietzsche, German philosopher, and so-called dynamite man, as he called himself. I am dynamite, among other things, an antichrist for some people. He said that, and this was a good thing that he said, is that we had murdered myth, we had killed myth, and we also said we murdered God, but that's another story for another time. Anyway, so that's good for now, I think, on myth.
so I agree. So hopefully that's clarified for many people out there who maybe had that misunderstanding still. So why do you think then it's important for us today to rediscover what myth really is? I think y'all sometimes, I mean, you know better than I do with your students. Sometimes it'll be like, who cares about myth anymore? So why do you think that's important for us to actually rediscover what myth really is today?
Well, great question. As I've just demonstrated too, we can't live without myth. We can't not live we can't not have a worldview, and therefore we cannot have a non-storied explanation about the way the world works. And I forgot to say that mythos and logos together forming this word mythologio, right? Or mythology, one of the conjugations of the word, it means both views of truth i.e. about reality together, right? Which is a really a unified way of looking at the world that we've forgotten on how to do. And that's kind of an answer to your next question. We've forgotten how to dissolve that difference between subject and object, even between heaven and earth, because we don't think in a unified sense anymore. And I want to comment on the theological implications of this later, that not everybody will agree with, of course. Excuse me. But what I mean is, that it's very important that we become mythical thinkers again. And Charlie Starr, who's coming on the show next week, who's written a great book about C.S. Lewis and myth, he says something like this. He says, man is not a myth, and that is a sad, sad fact. And that's exactly what Nietzsche said, is that modern man had killed myth. We had atrophied the imagination and relied so much on what he called the Apollonian side, the illusory side, the coping side of being human, that we would create these reasonable narratives and live within these, behind these walls that we create for ourselves, but wouldn't embrace the Dionysian aspects, the mythical, frenzied aspects of life. And we had kind of cordoned ourselves off from mythos. And Nietzsche was right about that. Man, and I mean, of course, in general here, human beings cannot live without mythos in their lives. And so what's important is this idea of not demythologizing, but remythologizing, which is putting the transcendence, putting the mythical quality, the idea that truth is more than just literal, that reality is more than just literal, and that the idea that reality is just literal is itself a myth. So you're already living inside a myth. You're just living inside a lobotomized, half-baked one that isn't really fully honest about itself, and it can't live up to its own standards. So, realize the lie you're living in. This is what C.S. Lewis was convinced by J.R.R. Tolkien to realize. I talk about it in my introduction, that he was living inside this rationalist, empiricist, or empirical storyline, which itself was a mythos. And so he just thought that was so funny, and yet so important that we recognize that. And so that's why I think it's important, and we need to be more honest that if you're going to take the view as a rationalist and rely on reason alone, reason can't appeal to reason. If you think you're just living in a physical universe with four walls and a roof, you wouldn't be able to know that unless you've seen from outside the four walls. You can't tell me I'm living in a box unless you know that we're not. So
Right.
right there, it kind of just tells you we need to be re-mythologized. We need to be re-enchanted, as Paul Gould and others are saying.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are just not answering this impulse that's stirred in them through images and film and literature and music, and relationships, and they're suffocating it. And Lewis says this in one of his famous essays. He says, we take revenge on this feeling. We call it romanticism or nostalgia. We try to say, oh, no, that's just me being adolescent again, Lewis says. But it's a longing for our true country, and we have to listen to it.
Yeah. Actually, I was just going to mention with as parents now and seeing how the imagination is such a huge part of both of our kids and just kids in general. Everyone always says kids have such a great imagination, and it's almost like as kids grow up we kind of stifle their imagination. It becomes more about teaching them be reasonable, and in a sense as adults I feel like there's so much we can learn from kids that they can teach us. And I think it's that feeling of nostalgia, a lot of times it's thinking back to your childhood or thinking back to memories about, oh, that was the good old days, when we were enchanted. And I think the fact that you want to show adults that we can be re-mythologized and re-enchanted, and I just think that it's really a really great thing for people to be aware of, and to know that you don't have to put aside childish things like Paul says, but what's that quote from C.S.
So
Lewis?
Lewis says, when I grew up, I put aside childish things, including the fear of being childish. And what by childish he meant, he was just playing on the verse, but he meant to put away being childlike. We should never do that.
Right.
And I want to say, Sarah, too, this is comment on this excellent topic here. Reason cannot rely on itself. It has to appeal to the imagination. So many scholars like Charlie Starr and Michael Ward and many others, Holly Ordway, have written books that say, look, it's important we understand what the imagination is. Paul Gould wrote a whole chapter on this in his Cultural Apologetics book, that the imagination is the intermediary between our senses and the faculty of reason. And that imagining that we can rely on logos alone is like having a tree that's floating in midair without a root system, without a trunk, which is imagination. You can't live without your imagination.
Mhm.
And Tolkien and Lewis both understood this. And on Fairy Stories, Tolkien's excellent essay on that same subject, he writes that, and in his letters too, I'm delighted to know that my telling of fairy stories is not just for children, because he didn't write it just for kids. The Hobbit is not just for kids, neither is especially the Lord of the Rings. Um, and it's for big kids who need to be reenchanted. And then you were probably also thinking, I know, knowing you, because I know you love this analogy that Lewis uses about the bicycle and his learning to ride a bicycle essay, something along those lines. And I learned this first from Gould's book, because we did that church class on cultural apologetics, and I loved it. I fell in love with the analogy that Lewis gives. We grow up first as kids, we're unenchanted as young kids, and then we're enchanted with the bicycle. We learn to ride it, and then we become disenchanted. We no longer go back to it, and then there's this need to become reenchanted again. And so many of us are in that, between that third and that fourth stage of learning to ride a bike, and we need to make the transition.
Mhm. Well, you mentioned how the stirrings that we feel as adults when we're reading great pieces of literature, or watching great films, or looking at good pieces of art, music, all the different things that kind of stir our imagination. So this was bringing the Lord of the Rings back into this, and other literature. And I know you'd wanted to talk about it a little bit. So how does the Lord of the Rings factor into all of this?
Yeah, well, there's so much to say here, but I unpack the complicated relationship between these very polyvalent, or I would say multivalent terms that have multiple meanings, like fairy story and myth and parable and allegory. And so I'll leave it to readers to look into chapter 1 for this, but the simplest way I can put it is whatever we end up calling the type of story that Lord of the Rings is, whether we say it's a parable, whether we say it's an allegory, or that one of these can also be called a fairy story, which it certainly is at least that, therefore that fairy story may be similar to either allegory or parable. So whatever we settle on calling it, what was more important to Tolkien is how it affects us and how the story is to be properly received. And it's first and foremost as a story. And so I would first say, getting that technical stuff out of the way, that it's important to understand that this is a myth. Okay. And now most people are going to hear that and say, right. Yeah, it's not true. No. It's more true. Okay. It's more true. It shows us the world the way it should be. That's what fairy is. F-A-E-R-I-E, fairy. The world of fairy is the world enchanted. It's the world of elves and men, Tolkien says, just differently perceived. This is a direct quote from his essay on fairy stories. And it is the Lord of the Rings is a subset of mythos, right? But mythos is a very general term. And now Tolkien says that in one of his letters. He says, my passion was for myth and fairy story or fairy tale, not allegory, not the conscious and intentional one. Again, I'm not going to get into that too much. I know you have a question about the parables later, but so maybe I'll touch on it again. But I think how this figures into it, of course, is that we need to receive the Lord of the Rings first and foremost as an aesthetic object. It is a work of art. And when we look at any great work of art, we need to, and remember, I haven't written this book until 2020. I mean, I began it in 2014. Technically 2012 when the Hobbit movies came out. And remember, I would sit at the table on our bay window in our old house and I would type up notes, just ruminations and reflections on the books and the movies. And those journal notes became notes, and then it became a conference paper in 2015. So I've been writing this book, and that was a decade plus after my first encounter. Well, all that time I had been annually reading The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion and The Hobbit, increasingly more times a year, actually, not just once a year, and immersing myself into it. And that's the process that we should take. We should give the work, the works, the books, the myths, a chance to work on us first, to feel the longing that comes through them, right? And then to reflect on it and say, how is that affecting me? What's going on? What's happening to me? Because it's going to do that. Any great story is going to. And of course, Tolkien understood that at some point, no literature is self-interpreting. So you're going to want to reflect about it. But when we do that, we just want to be very careful We want to be respectful of the author's intentions where we can. We want to be careful of it as an aesthetic object, but we don't want to not think about it. We don't want to not analyze it because we want to know how it's affecting us. So it's a very delicate tightrope to walk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering if I should wait to ask this question later, but
Yeah,
maybe no.
I trust
So
you.
these concepts that we're talking about, myth and imagination and stories, literature, parables, all of these concepts that you talk about in your book. I know here at Mythic Mission, one of the things you want to do is be able to help Christians, apologists, be able to preach the gospel and share Jesus through myth, through stories. So
Right.
how would you suggest somebody who, as a Christian wants to share this news with others? How would you suggest using literature? I mean, I know you said let the literature work on the person first, but how would you suggest, starting a conversation about this with somebody, or you know what I'm
Yeah,
asking?
I do. I do. It's an excellent question. Yeah, so I think it is a good thing to do. And I know that people are looking for these practical ways. And I'm not faulting you for this. I was asked this on several interviews in the last 6 months or almost 6 months. What's it been? 4 or 5 months?
Yeah, for
September, October, November. Yeah. Okay. So however long it's been, last couple months, I've just been doing interviews, and this question came up a lot. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but what I would recommend first for anybody is that you need to understand the gospel as story. And I want to recommend some books here for our listeners. Charlie Starr's book, The Fawn's Bookshelf, which talks about myth and meaning and truth and reality and all these concepts in literature a little bit in the writings of C.S. Lewis. I would say that Christians need to prepare themselves first to understand worldview and myth as being intertwined concepts, religion and myth. That is that every religion out there, Buddhism, Islam, secular humanism, all of them, they all tell a story. So get to know each of those stories. You can study a book by Alistair E. McGrath, like Narrative Apologetics, which he's got. He's got a book on C.S. Lewis, the intellectual life of C.S. Lewis, that talks about the history of myth and the importance of understanding myth as it pertains to apologetics. I would say Holly Ordway's book on, oh God, it was the title. Is it the, it's going to bother me until I look at it. I'll look it up here. Want to make sure I get the title right for our listeners. She has a new book on Tolkien coming out, but it's Apologetics and the Christian Imagination, an integrated approach. These are the kinds of books you need to study because it may be that, first of all, the word myth is still turning you off in that modern sense. So you need to kind of unteach yourself that. We need to understand the relationship between myth and literature and the incarnation and how we need to be presenting the Christian faith, which is all about God becoming flesh, among other things, but God becoming a person. We need to understand the integral and crucial importance that story, myth has related to the incarnation, that our mission needs to be incarnational, our mission needs to be mythical, and those two ways of saying the same thing. So I think study is important here. I'm trying to think of some other books that would be really helpful for readers. Well, readers, I guess, for those of you that follow our blog on the WordPress, but listeners, watchers. Alistair E. McGrath also has another book about C.S. Lewis and the importance of story. If I Had Lunch with C.S. Lewis. I mentioned Holly Ordway. Karen Armstrong, although I don't agree with her theology, really. A Short History of Myth is a great book, a primer on mythology. I think these are some great places to start, and understanding first the relationship of all these terms. Okay. And you need to understand how we are to analyze and discuss religions and the things they teach, and what story has to do with that, and seeing them as competing narratives, trying to tell a better story about the world, and to get away from this desire to prove which one is more rationally true. Because if you believe in revelation, then you believe that God is going to have that final say. And our job is to set the Holy Spirit up to do his work, and to just tell a better story. Okay, I know Joshua Chatraw also has a book out about telling a better story. I don't own it, but I've seen it. There are a lot of people out there writing books about this, okay? And I have written a book about it. So first, just kind of understanding that is really important. And then and only then can you really kind of go into a book as complex like Lord of the Rings and do what I was about to do, prepared to do, maybe I'll do it later, is to give you some examples about how to start a conversation, okay? Because you're trying to ultimately show how this story, and especially as a story, is related to the gospel and the gospel as a story, and that we need to inhabit that story and see that our lives make better comparative sense than they do in other stories. Okay, and there are elements and narrative plot points inside the Lord of the Rings and his other books that I would point to that would help you do this. But then I
Mhm.
would also simply say Peter Kraft had the most, I think, remarkable way of putting it, and that is ask the question, do you love the Lord of the Rings? And if you find somebody that does, and there are plenty of people that do, well, then you unconsciously, whether you know it or not, love the Christian story and start that as a conversation starter. But to do that, you need to know the Lord of the Rings well. But more importantly, you need to know your scripture. You need to know your Christianity well. And so also primers on apologetics. Apologetics, folks, is not just learning how to defend your faith. I just saw an excellent video by one of, I think it was Natasha Crane, who put out a video, Sarah, where I think I showed it to you about, or I told you about it. She talked about apologetics is not just about defending your faith, but is about learning about your faith. So you need to do that. And then you can kind of make that translation.
Well, you
So
won't be able to know the connections to the literature if you don't know about your faith and what it means and what it is. So
yeah, and if you're going to set yourself up like that and say, "Hey, you love Lord of the Rings?" Well, then did you know Lord of the Rings is a Christian story? No, I didn't. Oh, well, it's an unconsciously Christian story. Okay, so I sound like an auctioneer now, but I don't mean to. But if you're going to go that route, and then somebody's like, "Really?
yeah,
Explain that to me,"
and you kept
you're like,
nothing. Yeah.
"I don't know. My apologist friend told me to tell you this." That's not going to be a good witness. So, um,
Um,
yeah, go ahead.
No,
That's
just yeah, I know we won't talk about it today really, but I know in the future podcasts you're interested in diving into other literature besides Lord of the Rings too,
yes.
because I know yes, there are tons of fans of Lord of the Rings,
Oh
but I
yeah.
think too
Oh yeah.
if you do what Peter Kreeft says and ask someone, do you love Lord of the Rings, and what happens if they're like, nope, or
Yeah.
no, I have no interest in reading it. I think sometimes people are really turned off by the fantasy genre, as you would say. I'm not a big fan of fantasy. I wouldn't read that. But I think inherently we all are really drawn to what it is if we actually just took the time to read the literature that's there. I think a lot of people are intimidated by certain works of fiction, or
Oh, yeah.
maybe just have heard things and think, oh, that's not for me.
Mm.
But then once they got into it, would realize, oh, actually. So I know that there's other literature that you want to talk on too in the
Yeah.
future. Um, that
Sure.
would, I guess, would help be a path into letting people see you actually do love these things that you might think you don't initially.
Yes. And let's say something on this real quick before we transition is that one of the things I do in my book, and I spend a lot of time in the introduction building up to this, and then I talk less about it in the rest of the book because it's not relevant, but trying to reteach people not only about this relationship between myth and Christianity and why it's so important, and myth in all religions, i.e., worldviews, but to show that the Christian myth, as Dr. Marcos has recently shown in his book with Greco Roman stories, but to expand that to all stories, to show how Christianity is the myth became fact, to show that it is the myth made fact, to show that it is the myth that makes sense of other myths, that tells a better story, and also has a place in its story for all the other story people have told. This is what Tolkien says in the On Fairy Stories essay. He says the Gospels contain a fairy story, perhaps the greatest, and that contain the essence of all fairy stories. And this is exactly what Lewis says in different words in his Myth Became Fact, 1940 something essay. I think it was in the 40s when he wrote it, which was 10 plus years after that famous talk they had in 1931 that brought Lewis to go from theism to Christianity. Most people don't know that Lewis went from early Christianity in Ireland to atheism to theism and then to Christianity. And showing what does this have to do with the Lord of the Rings? That Lord of the Rings also contains other elements from other myths and i.e. religions or worldviews that If you find them there, well, good. That doesn't contradict the fact that it's Christian. It makes it more Christian. It makes it, as Dr. Marco said in the interview last week, not less than Balder, more than Balder, right? We have Balder in there, but Christ is more than Balder. So it lifts up Balder and completes the Balder myth, and the Anglo-Saxon elements and the Finnish elements in there that I'm not familiar with, but other experts are, the Greco-Roman elements, all of them that are in there. People always point to the Lord of the Rings and they say, oh, well, that contradicts that it's Christian. Yeah, if your understanding of Christianity is all or nothing, that either all truth and beauty and goodness is in Christianity or it's not, well, that's a misunderstanding of truth. It's a misunderstanding of Christian theology also. Well, yeah, that will be your conclusion. So if you read the introduction of my book, I talk about this and I correct a lot of these misperceptions. So good, bring on the, yeah, I see other elements of other myths in there. You're supposed to, just like you're supposed to, because Tolkien wanted it to match the same real world activity that as a Christian, if you're really paying attention, you see and detect hints of Christ and other myths. Now there's the question, of course, well, why don't we detect, hints of Buddha? Why does it have to be Christ? Well, we talked about this in the last week's interview, so I'd encourage you to watch that. Maybe we'll do another episode with that, but that's an interesting objection and a good one, but I think I've made my point.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so from here, I don't know where you want to go.
Well, I guess I kind of want to go back to your book, in the actual preface, and there's a couple questions I think that you address in your other podcast and other ones that you've been on, interviews you've been on. So I want to encourage people to go and listen to the other podcasts you've been on. But I wanted to pull out a quote that was from your preface, the very first page, actually. Just to ask you a little more about it. So what you said was, although it has taken several years for me to discover this, The Lord of the Rings restored my ability to read scripture properly and hear it for what it is, good news. The Lord of the Rings re-mythologized and re-enchanted the biblical narrative for me when I needed it the most. So can you elaborate a little bit on how did it do that? How did it help you read scripture properly?
Yeah, well, C.S. Lewis said in his book Miracles, which was a response to naturalistic philosophy in his time period, and I think it was in response to a scientist, female scientist at the time, that was very outspoken about it. He said, the people who really understand nature best are those that get away from her. That you understand from the supernatural perspective. So we need to go a little away from her to see her more clearly, and this is the same principle. And this gets us into indirect communication and myth, right? Which myth is indirect communication. It's not direct communication. It's indirect communication. Well, in that same kind of sense, you have to sometimes go away from scripture in order to understand it. This is why it's so important that Christians understand that it isn't all or nothing. Everything outside of Christianity is darkness and satanic, and everything inside it is light. No, that's not how God made things. The fullness of truth and light and goodness and beauty, yes, is found in Christ and in the scripture, which are our touchstones in that order. Christ and then scripture, I think, is most importantly. And Christ says scripture testifies to me, right? Not the other way around. However, it works that way too. But the important thing here to, I think, keep in mind is that sometimes we need to really get away from things in order to understand things best. And in fact, what Jesus did on the road to Emmaus is he said, go back to the story well in the Torah and look for me there, right? And so you know the Torah. I mean, these were two Jewish people. They knew the scriptures very well, but he said, go back. And they might have said to him, why should we go back? We know the story of Moses. Why do we need to read it again? But Jesus in Luke 24, he says, well, you're going to find me there. You're going to find me in the prophets. You're going to find me in the writings. So my comment on this is that, like what Lewis said, I needed to get away from it. And so in that time between 2001 and 2010, as I was kind of just a baby Christian, kind of just gathering data, gathering information, trying to reorder it. You can have a bunch of information, but not know how to arrange it. And that was kind of, I guess, what I learned later, looking back on that time period, what had happened. And so that's what I meant by, although it has taken several years. And I would only be able to know that retrospectively, that, I didn't know what I was doing reading scripture. And that this book, how did it do that? Through the image of the exiled and returning king. It was the thing that haunted me the first time I read the book. Something about it resonated with me. It resonates with so many people. I know of one book that has done some scientific research on this, where they've done brain scans on people watching that scene from the films and reading that part of the book. There's something that it just lights up certain parts of the brain. There's something powerful about this image, this type. And I didn't know that at the time, but I knew the power of that mythic symbol, that image of Aragorn and the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor and the Dunedain and the Numenorians and all that whole story. And those nerds out there will get all these terms that relate to Aragorn's people, that I talk about in the book. And then seeing at the end when he's coronated and the eagle soaring over Minas Tirith saying, "Your king is returning to you and he will be with you all the days of your life." And I read that and it stuck with me and it stuck with me. And then over the years, I finally said, well, this language sounds like it's in the Bible. And then I met an author, N.T. Wright, who put the gospel in those terms. And then it all clicked.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same story, but it's not the same story, of course, because Tolkien's story is unique, but the same contours of the myth are there.
Right.
And that's what re-enchanted me. And then I came back to the Bible, to scripture, with a whole new appreciation of it. And then I also knew how to read it better because I understood more about myth. I understood about its relationship to worldview and the incarnation and how we should be modeling a very incarnational approach to our apologetics. It's not just logos based, but mythologos, that it's also mythically driven. And I think that's how it did it.
And I think that's very encouraging for a lot of Christians. I know you mentioned that, there's so many Christians that think you have to run completely away from everything that's not directly within Christianity. So you can only read the Bible. You can't read anything else, I read the Bible because that's what I was brought up to do, and not understanding it. But it's reassuring to know, reading these stories and watching films or things that stir up an understanding of scripture that you never had, being able to go back in and now read the scripture and go, oh, and now I understand this, or a story that Jesus shared. Now that makes more sense because of something that I've watched, or in the fact that people can be brought closer to God through stories that are written by humans, is
Yes,
very encouraging.
it is. And I'm glad you find it to be so.
I do, thank you. So I know too, because I don't know how much more time we have, probably not too much.
We're just under an hour, so we can go for a little while longer. I usually do a little bit if you can do
Yeah.
it.
All right. Well, just you've talked about in your preface and on some of the other interviews that these next two questions I have kind of go hand in hand, because you've talked about what inspired you to write this book, but on the same hand is that what sets your book apart from others on the subject of Tolkien's works and Christianity, because there are other works. I know there are several Tolkien fans who absolutely loathe when there's any mention of Christianity or Christian themes. They want that to be completely separate. And then there are works about Tolkien and Christianity. And so what makes your book different from those works that are on Tolkien and Christianity?
Well, I think great question, honey. I think that the Tolkien scholars that do this, whether they're secular or religious or somewhere searching and seeking still, it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, of course, but setting that aside, I think the reason they say this is because they love Tolkien and they know what he said about allegory, and they know what he said about allegory and Arthurian myth and Christian myth. And I know that it is also, I think, sadly, because they're not properly trained on a real ancient understanding of myth. But I also think, more importantly, as Heiser said in our interview, Dr. Michael Heiser said, I think not only do they need a little mythic education, but they need to go back to read their scripture again through ancient Israelite eyes, and need a crash course on real Christian theology, robust, historical, Orthodox Christian theology. And like we were talking earlier about the all or nothing truth thing, it's stuff like that. And I think they're thinking, well, there's Finnish mythology and other Scandinavian mythology, because I think Finland's kind of technically outside of Scandinavia, if I'm not mistaken. You have Greco-Roman mythology and Anglo-Saxon mythology that's in the books, and you can't say it's Christian. And so they're up in arms about it because they don't understand the myth made fact sort of argument. But I think also it's because this term allegory is so loaded, and they're not familiar with some of the great scholars I consulted for my book, that some of them are writing from a Christian perspective, some of them are not, that really go deep on the terms parable, allegory, and have really thought long and hard about it, and all the ink that's been spilled about it. And I think that people just aren't digging deep enough and getting a more nuanced understanding. And so they're just writing it off. Oh, it's just another that kind of allegory that Tolkien disliked. But of course, I present solid evidence from Tolkien's own mouth, and revisions of things that I think people have misunderstood, which is my take on what he said, that show, and this is what makes my book unique, that we don't need to fear anything from allegory, because there's only one type of allegory that we do need to be afraid of, because it reduces the story to something Tolkien would not want it to be. And it also reduces the Christianness in the story and reduces Christianity to something that is unrecognizable. And I think that's what he feared. He didn't fear allegory in general, but one kind of allegory. And then the difference between allegory as a composition and allegorical language I get into. So I think there's just a lot. And that's what people need to be patient when they're reading my book, especially the introduction in chapter 1. It's long. It needs to be, because there's so much. You're just not aware until you look at my bibliography. So much, there has been so much contention over this issue. And I really try to put it to rest. And one of the things my first publisher, before I had to switch publishers, really, I think, appreciated what they told me, is that I addressed that in a satisfactory way. And as I did more and more research on that, I realized it was going in more of a New Testament parable direction than that first publisher would have liked. But thankfully for Whitfenstock, we found a good home for the book. So I think that's what really makes it unique, but then also how we can respect the story, whatever we call it in the end, as a story, and that it's not just a carbon copy of what's in the Bible. Otherwise, it wouldn't teach us anything new about the Bible. And so your previous question about how the Lord of the Rings did this to me would be invalid. I think that's something we need to really dig deeper on. And so I hope my book will do that for people and kind of show you what the big fuss is about these terms and why they're so loaded.
Right.
It is complicated. I can't apologize for that. That's the way it is.
But I think it's necessary for us to engage in that critical thinking to truly understand the terms, so we don't just write them off. And I want to encourage listeners to, if they haven't listened to your Michael Heiser podcast yet, on the Naked Bible podcast, that you really dive deep into the whole spectrum of allegory that you talk about in your book, that you've kind of seen the conscious intentional allegory on one end and then the parable fairy story on another. And I think that if you really want to get a good idea of those terms, to listen to that podcast for sure.
And thank you, sweetie. I think also what's important, two things, is to point out that I know that, again, a lot of scholars are going to hear that and say, oh, how could you? Wait until you see my argument first and realize that I may not be using these terms the way that you think I am. That's the first thing. And so I really think the cautious and judicious scholars among academia and laypersons will be thoughtful and say, let me give this a chance. Because I can tell you there have been far less thoughtful books written on Tolkien and religion, as Dr. Ordway just recently pointed out in a talk she and I did with Justin Brierley, that there are a lot of books out there that really just cheapen it and say, oh, this equals that. And so she's absolutely right. So give it a chance.
Yeah.
But there was another thing I was going to say about this, and it kind of slipped my mind, but it'll come back, I'm sure, in due time. But I think it's important that we give it a chance and that realize that I might be saying parable and fairy story, and it may not be the way that you think that I'm referring to it, but that other point is gone. So we'll see if we can find it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but give your book a chance. Don't judge a book by its cover. Although your cover is a very awesome cover.
Yeah.
And if we're just judging on the cover alone,
Kelly Sims and yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know we'll talk you'll talk in future podcasts, or maybe have me on again. We can talk more about, you mentioned earlier about more of the practical aspects of how Lord of the Rings can be an apologetic for Christianity. So we'll into that later, but to wrap it up, at least for me to wrap it up, what kind of content can listeners expect to hear on your podcast in the future? So to help them want to stay tuned in, or any last thoughts that you want to leave your listeners with tonight?
Yeah, I really wish that I remembered that point I was trying to make. It was really an important one too, because it's not just that I don't want readers to write this off, but to understand that it was very important to Tolkien how we understand how the story works on us, not so much what we ultimately call it. But I remember now. One of my great platforms that and shoulders that I'm standing on, a great scholar and also Jesuit priest that knew Tolkien, was a friend of Tolkien and the family starting in the 1940s, that was a confidant for Tolkien in parts of the Lord of the Rings that he discussed with him. And many of the letters, the only collection of letters we have about Tolkien, are addressed to Father Robert Murray, who's part of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits in the Catholic Church. And Murray, in 1992, for the Tolkien centenary, for his 100th celebration of his 100 years after his birth in 1892, I have the book up here. It's an essay and part of the Tolkien A Celebration compendium of essays that celebrate that event, that centenary. And what's really important, just in the title alone, is that it's called Tolkien and the Art of the Parable. And the connections he makes there between parable and fairy story should be explored further, I said. And that's why I wrote the book. For many of the other reasons that I've said, is that I wanted to take this person that was so close to Tolkien and saw this before me or anybody else obviously did. And I wanted to try to explore that in more detail using contemporary research on allegory and parable and great scholarship on Tolkien to get a closer look at what Murray seems like he didn't finish or didn't pick up again in his lifetime. But it's an excellent little essay, and I wish he had pressed it further, but I'm also glad that he didn't, in a sense, because I can hopefully contribute in my humble way. So, but that itself should kind of say, give it a chance, because it's something that you might as well call it Tolkien and the Art of the Allegory, because that's what a lot of people think parable is, and so they'll write it off. Anyway, for the podcast, Mythic Mission. So Sarah, I hope you'll come on again and do this with me. This was fun. I know we have to kind of put on personas and pretend like we're very professional. So I let that S-bomb slip earlier, so I apologize for my audiences. Hopefully that wasn't a turnoff, but I'm human. So setting that aside, what I'd like to get you excited about is the many topics that I'd like to explore in the near future. First of all, most importantly, I'm going to be having some really stellar guests on the show. Dr. Charlie Starr is coming on to talk about C.S. Lewis and myth and many other things, including a lost screw tape letter, which is great. We'll talk about that next week on the 24th of January with him. It'll be audio and video, so we'll have both versions. I know I have, I think, hopefully, to look forward to Mary Jo Sharp and her husband Roger Sharp, if all things work out there. I know she's recovering from COVID, so prayers for her. Hopefully that'll be a guest that will come on. Dr. Bradley Berzer, who's written a great book on Tolkien. It's called J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, one of the books that I relied on doing research for my book, and a really great Catholic perspective, which Tolkien was a Catholic, so that's very important. He's probably going to be coming on maybe later in February, March, so that's a little ways off. I think he's also working on a review for my book. I don't know if that's something to expect sooner or later, but that's great news, good news. Of course, we had Dr. Louis Marcos on last week, who also wrote a review of my book, the first I'm sorry, not the first review, but the most complete review, I think, that's out there on Reformation 21, which is a website that you can find easily. And you can also click to follow our WordPress here on the blog to get access to that review, which is on my website. He's probably going to come on again. In all honesty, I think he was excited to maybe do something in the future, so that should be good. And that's the lineup so far, so that's something to look forward to. That's a lot of great guests. But aside from that, I'm going to be delving into some of the non-Christian myths that I think are important, that we learn how to understand how they're telling their stories in contrast to how the Christian story. So we'll give it through a Christian perspective at some point in these walkthroughs I'll be doing, but we're also going to be doing deep dives from the point of view of other myths, like the Witcher books by Andrzej Sapkowski, who is the author, a Polish author of those books, whose universe has been described as very existentialist and therefore Sartrean, kind of Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And also the Nietzschean blues. I saw an article online recently that delves into the works of Nietzsche and the Witcher universe. So that should kind of give you a taste of what to expect there. We're going to do the Chronicles of Narnia. We're going to do Harry Potter. I've got a great series of books that I don't know if anybody I know people have heard of them, but I don't hear people talking about them enough, and that's a shame. the Imaginarium Geographica series by James A. Owens, which is a great set of 7 or 8 books that are bundled together and actually features fictional young versions of Jack, C.S. Lewis, his nickname, and Tollers, or John J.R.R. Tolkien, along with Hugo Dyson and some other people you recognize. So it's a really fun kind of young adult book series, but it's really a great read. And I know I've got some others. I just can't think of them off the top of my head that I'm going to do. Um, Problem is I've got kind of books on one device and on another, but those are some things just to look forward to in the near future. I know also, superheroes, we'll be doing something on Marvel, and
I
even
wanted to mention that earlier and I forgot, but yeah, I would love for us to do one on superheroes and
yes,
Marvel. Something I did want to talk about. Definitely something we could do in the
which I
future.
think you would love to do. And I know you're not as much of a gamer as I am, but you can get up there sometimes. But the Legend of Zelda series, I just got a book recently that walks through some salient philosophical reflections on those series of games, which are very beloved for a lot of people who grew up with that series. So video games, literature, especially literature, and some movies too, or like with Marvel, you've got everything, but you've got movies and you've got literature, obviously comics, which I'm not an expert on, but you've got some of the things we can kind of do crossovers there. So there's lots of fun topics on the horizon. If you're looking to make suggestions, I'd always love to hear them. Sarah and I would love to entertain them and see if we can make it doable. So in addition to that, I'll be doing some brief dives into parts of my book, but also, of course, we'll be featuring a lot of Middle Earth podcast episodes, things that I couldn't talk about as much in my book, or aspects of my book, little parts, not big swaths of conversations, but little parts where we can take a little closer look at some things without, space limitations. Writing a book, I always had to be concise in certain areas. I know people are thinking, they look at the book, oh my God, that's concise. Well, yeah, for this subject, but at least we'll be a little freer to talk in the podcast about some things. So obviously Middle Earth related stuff. That was me trying to be concise. That is years and years and years of research and reflection on some really complicated topics, especially that allegory business was a nightmare to work through. So
Yeah.
you're welcome. So Middle Earth stuff, definitely look forward to. I haven't even taken a step back to think about what we should really talk about there. There's just so much. But a good start would be places in my book. So we'll do that. And
Which the last thing I just want to say is maybe in the YouTube when the YouTube video you can put a link to your book on Amazon.
yes.
And for Whipped and Stock, but just I don't have the actual physical copy in front of me, but I have the on my iPad. There
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
Although you can't read it very well, can you?
Yeah. Good news of the return of the King, gospel. No.
There's the cool cover. The Good News of the Return of the King, the Gospel in Middle Earth. So if you haven't bought it yet, it's on Amazon and whippedandstock.com, and it's on Kindle for only $9.99.
Yep. And if you have a Kobo, or it's really affordable, or if you have any other e-reader, it's on virtually everywhere fine books are sold. I found it on the Kobo site. It's on Amazon, which is the most popular one. It's on Whip and Stock's website. And Sarah, you helped me put. There's a link. If you go to our YouTube page, there is a. I got to figure out how to put this into Anchor or iTunes. So if you're listening on the
Yeah.
podcast, the best way to do this is to look for me on Facebook, or to. There it is. Yeah. I'm trying to find out how we'll get it for our podcast listeners. I'll try to see in maybe the episode description or in the podcast description to put a link for my website.
Yeah.
Where if you go to my website, which is a WordPress site, there are links to YouTube, book reviews, interviews, podcasts, links to my book, etc. Just everything is bundled there. But there, if you're on YouTube, there are little icons on the About section of the YouTube page, which can take you to all of these places as well, including my website. So please subscribe to the podcast, etc. Yada yada. So there was just a couple other things that I wanted to say that I'm not going to be able to say tonight, but I want to really talk a little bit more about myth as indirect communication. And I just want to finish with a testimony, if I could, Sarah, from one of Tolkien's readers in the mid 20th century who wrote him, and kind of sets this up for our talk next time. Maybe we'll do a podcast on that. This was an unbelieving man. It's letter 328 in the collection of letters edited by Humphrey Carpenter, the only collection we have of Tolkien's letters. And he writes to Tolkien, he says, "You create a world in which some sort of faith seems to be everywhere without a visible source, like light from an invisible lamp." And these words, you got to really unpack them. They're just so profound. Tolkien thought so. And he then comments that the other author, God, took over and wrote the book. This wasn't him, in his very understated, modest, and humble way. And I mean that with the greatest respect for Tolkien. He was always deferring his book and his writing to the authorship of God and the Holy Spirit, which is just wonderful. But what's profound about this, not only Tolkien's response, but that this is a testimony to a lot of things, but it's a testimony to the power that myth has as indirect communication, that we um, sometimes benefit more from a narrative approach that enfolds and conceals a propositional message, an argument, if you will, or evidence that you could otherwise deliver straightforwardly. Sometimes it's best to do that by sneaking around the watchful dragons of our rational mind and going through the imagination. This is the indirect approach. It's literally what the word parabolane means. It can mean thrown from the side unexpectedly. It's indirect. And this is so powerful. And it's clear that this gentleman knew that there was some sense of power with a capital P, right, in Middle Earth. Not Sauron or Aragorn or the Valar or Iluvatar. I'm not sure if he had read at that point. He couldn't have read the Silmarillion, but he detected something, right? It was outside the story that pervaded and shined into the story. So I think it's just very powerful. So maybe we'll do an indirect communication and myth thing in the future.
I would love that.
I would love it too. You did an awesome job, and my favorite guest to have on the show is Sarah, so that's great. And also for everybody to see that she has something, more than something to contribute, and hopefully she'll be doing some of these walkthroughs of literature, especially the Harry Potter stuff. And you should maybe think of doing something on the Hunger Games if you want to look at that, because that would be another great series I'd love to hear kind of a breakdown of. So if you ever wanted to get back into those, that would be cool.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
So anyway, we're open to ideas from you. So let us know. And thanks, honey, for doing this with me. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
So too. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, we'll see you next time on Mythic Mission. This is Professor Michael Jahosky and Sarah Jahosky signing out. Bye-bye.
Bye.